Today, we'll be talking about 5 low-light photography mistakes that you need to avoid.
And this helpful guide is brought to you by our friends over at Zeiss Camera Lenses.
Mistake number 1, using flash. Direct flashes are terrible. Hardly anyone ever looks flattering with direct flash. It creates this deer in the headlights look.
Now, just to specify, I am talking about the built-in flash on your camera. Off-camera flashes and flashes that are separate attachments are omitted from this mistake.
You see, what happens is if you're shooting an auto with your camera and the camera detects that it's in the dark, it will automatically pop up that flash. And sometimes it's super funny watching people try to shoot into the dark sky and their flash goes off. It literally does nothing except ruining other people's time lapses. Curse you, Karen!
Yes, believe it or not, I've had random flashes pop up in my time lapses before due to beginners not knowing how to work their cameras. But that's okay, I'm here to point you in the right direction. Quite literally. If you're going to be using a flash and it's possible to aim your flash up, like mine, you can use the ceiling to bounce the light and create a more flattering image of your subject. Now, if there are no ceilings for you to bounce the light, you can try diffusing your flash with a napkin.
So I have this napkin that I stole from Starbucks earlier. I'm gonna drape this over the flash and we're gonna see what happens. We're gonna take one without the napkin, and we'll take one with the napkin. 1, 2, and 3. All right, now we'll take one with the napkin. My lens is so big that the flash is literally casting the shadow of the lens on you. So this illustrates my point somewhat pretty well because as you can see, the flash casted a pretty harsh shadow because of the lens. The lens is so big, so the shadow on you, it looks really harsh, but when I soften it,
that looks good.
That shadow is not as harsh. So
like
that still kind of proves my point.
I like that one.
Boom, easy.
By the way, if you want to take better low-light photos without ever using your on-camera flash at all, queue up my next video on low-light photography without flash.
Mistake number 2, shooting at a shutter speed that is way too fast. Now, this is a super easy mistake to make, and my $4,000 professional camera here likes to make that mistake when it's on auto. Now, I don't mean to offend anybody who's shooting auto with these types of cameras. Auto generally does work pretty well when there's a lot of lights, but when it's in a low light situation like where we are at right now, it prioritizes sharp and steady photos. So what it does is that it raises the shutter speed higher than necessary.
So what do I mean by too fast of a shutter speed? When you run your shutter speed dial to the right, you're raising your shutter speed. This is great for freezing action, but also lessen the amount of light coming in. For example, if your shutter speed is at 1/125 and you're moving it to 1/250 or 1/500 or 1/8000, then that's raising the speed of your shutter. Vice versa, if you start at 1/125 but you move down to 1/50, 1/5, 1 second, 15 second, 30 second, then that's slowing down your shutter speed, allowing in more light. To make sure you're maximizing the amount of light coming in, I recommend moving over to manual mode. If you're a full frame user, set your shutter speed to match the focal length you're shooting in. Since I'm shooting with a 40mm here, my shutter speed will be at 1/40th of a second. If you're an APS-C or crop sensor shooter, you will want your shutter speed to double your focal length. For example, if you're also using a 40mm, you will need to shoot at shutter speed 1/80. As for aperture value, I would set it to f3.5. If you can go even lower than that, like f2.8, f1.8, or even f1.4, that would be great. But if you notice you're missing focus quite a bit, then go back up the other way. For ISO, I'd recommend keeping below 6400 if you're a full frame user and 3200 if you're an APS-C user. Now, these are just my recommended settings for beginners. Once you understand how each settings work, you can start bending the rules yourself. For example, shooting at an even slower shutter speed for some interesting results, and still be able to get some pretty sharp photos.
So don't be afraid to slow your shutter speed down to 1/15 or 1/10. You can still get some pretty decent low light results if you have a camera or a lens with some sort of stabilization built in. And not only that, when you slow down your shutter speed, you can get some pretty cool motion effect in your photos.
By the way, this is situation dependent. If you do slow your shutter speed down drastically, any motion that happens during your shot will be blurred. So if that's not your intended purpose, make sure you raise that shutter speed to freeze the action. Moving on, I don't ever recommend photographing in a super dimly lit area. It is just impossible, and usually the photos don't come out that great. But there are some exceptions, like this digital arts museum that we were in. No matter how good a camera is, it can still have trouble finding your subject in the dark. So mistake number 3, letting your camera hunt focus.
Now, if your camera is having trouble finding focus in the dark, don't be afraid to use manual focus. It's gonna save you a lot of time trying to manual focus your subject in the dark rather than letting the camera focus hunt in the dark room.
If you're a mirrorless camera user, you are in luck. You will likely have a feature called focus peaking. When you enable that, little dots will appear on the back of your camera screen, letting you know that your subject is in focus. The more dots you have, the more accurate your focus is. To learn more about using focus peaking when manually adjusting the focus of your shot, refer to my video right up here. Moving on to mistake number 4.
Now, I do want to caution you when you're filming with really bright lights in a dark area, make sure you do not blow out the highlights. Something like this is easily could be overblown in your photos and it won't look that great. So make sure you keep the highlights below the clipping level. So you may be asking, what is below the clipping level? Your camera might have something called a histogram. If the graph leans way towards one side of the graph, that means you're either clipping the black levels or the white levels. So try to keep that graph in the center of that rectangle for the best exposure for your shots.
For cityscape shots especially, it is super easy to blow out the neon signs and the available lighting. So my best tip for you is to expose for the highlight. If your camera does not have that histogram thing that I was talking about, set it to what looks right to your eyes.
Mistake number 5, not doing any sort of editing to your photo. The only way to make your photo pop is by doing some editing. I know it sounds scary, but no matter how correct your settings are, your photo is gonna look a little bit bland. So take it to Lightroom CC, take it to Capture One Pro, whatever editing software, mess around with some of the settings to make your photo pop.
Try playing around with the exposure, the highlights, the shadows, the color tones, even the saturation. It will make the photo infinitely times better. For night photography, I personally like the cooler temperature tone, so I move the temperature slider to the left. If I feel like the photo can be a little bit brighter, I will raise the exposure, but this is also where I drop the highlights down too when I start noticing certain parts of the image look too bright. After that, I would increase the shadows in case the details of my subject is a little too dark. And the final thing that I like to do is to add a little bit of vignetting to the area that I want my viewer to focus on. Editing is a personal taste, so don't be afraid to just mess around and see what kind of results you can achieve.
Drop in the comments down below if you want to see a more in-depth photo editing guide from me. Christmas and New Year are just around the corner, so plenty of low-light photography opportunities coming up, so don't be making these mistakes. Tag me on Instagram at JasonVMedia because I would love to see some of your low-light results. And just in case I don't get another video out in time, have a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, and we'll see you in 2020.